Hegel, Nietzsche, and Weber, is used to manage the transition from aristocratic to democratizing societies and the tensions that are associated with a growing democratic enfranchisement. This language is also often racialized, as seen in the comparisons in Mill's On Liberty to the so-called barbaric Turks, to the Chinese and their foot-binding practices, the so-called Hindus and their rituals, even as race itself is not directly theorized or taken up. That is, race is not directly theorized until W.E.B. Du Bois enters into this conversation. He reprises the same terms of maturity, but situates them as beset by the thought of Western progress, of emancipation, and the ineluctable undertow of civilization's afterthought. Regardless, in Du Bois as in Kant, maturation is a process rather than an endpoint, and a fraught one at that. The question that I want to pose here today is this: how is the figure of the immature, or the figure of juridical minority, deployed within the French imperial nation state so as to smooth over contradictions between its Republican commitment to care, solidarity, and publics and equality, and its literal insistence on singularity, responsibility, and property ownership? And how is this figure of the childlike minor, bereft of experience, written out of history, and so becomes a figure that is unable to inspire, to signify, or to authorize new meanings? French translations of these works often translate immaturity as état mineur, or as tutelle, meaning tutelage. As law and politics become much more deeply imbricated one with the other, the moral and political tones of maturity start to converge on those of juridical minority. For Kant, the goal of maturation is for the politically immature to throw off their Gängelwagen, that is, their literally kiddie walkers, their go-karts, and to literally shake off their dependencies and to walk forward on their own, to experience politics for themselves. The contestatory maturation that he envisions, where there's a contest between the immature and those doctors, those educators, those preachers who would teach them to be otherwise, this contestatory maturation is much easier for us to stomach when we think in terms of the child, since we think of children as natural dependents who ought learn independence through struggles with their parents and other authority figures. Yet during the same period of the 18th and 19th centuries, European trade with the Black Atlantic increases exponentially, and the juridical terms of minority often take on racial and civilizational attributes so as to bolster the status of adult majors. Progress and innovation become defined in contradistinction to the tradition of, for example, Mill's China and India, countries that presumably lack the singular experience that might sustain a maturation process that goes beyond mere imitation. This is what I understand Agamben to be referencing when he argues in his essay, Infancy in History, that experience is destroyed for lack of the authority to claim and define it. Agamben locates the expropriation of experience in the founding of modern science, a founding which turned experience into experiment. And note that in French, these words are the same. Expérience means both experiment and experience. Experiments allow for science and knowledge to become separated and distinct, where mind and body were once in contact with one another through the pneuma, or the spirit, or sometimes through what was called aesthesis, or common sense, and so could form some notion of the integrated whole, or the common. Modern science has given us a new subject. Experience once served to advance individuals towards maturity. This is what Agamben defines as, quote, an anticipation of death as the idea of an achieved totality of experience. But the new subject of science seeks only to increase its knowledge. As a result, fantasy and dreams shift in their relation to the subject. The shift of fantasy's relation to the subject then comes to index what Agamben terms mental alienation and the imaginary, that is, everything that no longer has a place in experience and is cut off from it. So in reflecting on modern juridical minority, my comments here today seek to tease out this connection between experience, science, and the imaginary in a very specific site, that of 1950s France and colonial French North Africa, and to think about what happens to mental alienation as it becomes caught up in debates within psychiatry and law. Mental alienation, or in French, aliénation mentale, is also the French term for madness or insanity, and is deeply bound up in notions of legal minority. Legal minority designates, again, that moral and political tutelage that characterizes the subordinate status, often of women, colonized subjects, and the so-called mad or aliénés. Because they lack what counts as experience, these figurations of the minor are perceived as unable to sustain the relationships of responsibility or to own property. In short, they're unable to become Republican citizens. I call this the alibi of minority, since minor juridical status is used to justify subordination first established on other terms. This alibi is more than a hypocrisy to be exposed. It confuses the childlike, the so-called childlike, with actual children, and so confuses the nature of the trauma and its relation to history that results from the destruction of experience. Where childhood trauma can be addressed by recovering the ambivalence or the lost meaning that might connect past to present, adult trauma cannot. There is no symbol to recover so as to work through distress. Instead, there is simply the brutally concrete experience of being forced to confront the present on its terms, on terms that are not your own, and to be cut off from the capacity for fantasy and imagination. The alibi of minority thus not only justifies claims of hierarchy and citizenship, it also contains and constricts potential political agency. Being cut off from fantasy and imagination is a way to dissociate the psyche from the material world. It is a way to deny the potential to symbolize and to imagine a shared condition that would organize a world on different terms. So in my remarks today, I will think about where Agamben's essay leaves us. His essay is titled Infancy and History, the Destruction of Experience. And so I will literally work backwards through the terms of this title, thinking first about the destruction of experience lived by the aliéné as minor. Second, I'll pick up the way that history, differently used, might serve to suture this dissociation between psyche and material world. And third, I will finish by thinking about how we might break with the minor and instead take up Agamben's notion of infancy, which he writes as in-fancy, so as to regenerate the capacity to imagine and to think symbolically. So it's been a late night. I also imagine that we do not all have Agamben right at our fingertips. So let me begin by excavating a bit the backstory of his reading of the minor. As I just suggested, Kant draws on this language of minority and what is enlightenment when he claims that men have only just begun to emerge from their self-imposed minority, again in French rendered as tutelle. In his essay, Conflict of the Faculties, Kant situates this process of becoming mature as one that is caught between the tussle amongst religion, law, medicine, and the faculty of philosophy to define the terms on which subjectivity can become known. The language of maturity thus becomes reframed on terms of judgment by Weber in the vocation lectures, on terms of self-overcoming and transvalorization by Nietzsche, and then is reformulated as a kind of post-Kantian radical critique by Foucault in his lectures on frank speech. At stake in each of these formulations is the type of experience that will allow the human to appear before community. What kind of subjectivity is going to come to anchor politics? Each thinker imagines different practices of authority and authorship that will ground and regulate this experience through distinctions between majority and minority. Over the 19th century, this language of minority is deeply caught up in questions of political access and enfranchisement. If Kant and others emphasize the never-ending process of maturation as a hallmark of political and moral perfectionism, that is the constant revision of politics in light of some kind of ideal end, my comments here today address the never-ending process of becoming minor. Specifically, how does Agamben help us to think about the status of those minor characters central to a historical colonial narrative organized around others more readily identified as protagonists? Agamben opens his essay with the claim that something like experience is no longer available to us. For just as modern man has been deprived of his biography, he writes, his experience has likewise been expropriated. Agamben locates the expropriation of experience in the founding of modern science, a founding which turned experience into experiment. Experiments, as I've suggested before, allow for science and knowledge to become separated and distinct. It becomes a way to take up a new subject, one that is differently connected to some notion of political community or the common. The experience that once serves to advance individuals towards a presence of maturity in this community is what Agamben defines as an anticipation of death as the idea of an achieved totality of experience. Again, fantasy and dreams shift in their relationship to this subject. We start to find ourselves confronted with the question of how could we imagine, how could we fantasize, how could we do differently? As Ross suggested on Monday, psychoanalysis at this point of the 19th century becomes a vocabulary without parallel. But I would argue not just for its subtlety, but also because of its intimacy. It has an intimacy that sprawls across multiple registers of the normative, the historical, the social, and the psychic. Agamben argues that psychoanalysis reminds us that the most important experiences are not those that are driven by the ego, but those that are located in the id. And yet, because the id itself is ahistorical, grappling with the id demands a very different kind of historical narration. The id demands a constant awareness of how we compose history, how we fashion symbolic structures, in short, how we articulate what is to be taken as experience. The ability to shape experience through language becomes the defining feature of adulthood. Infancy is rendered as silence. Here it is helpful to remember that immaturity, or Kant's Unmündlichkeit, is the lack of voice or Mund, mouth. If the idea of infancy as a presubjective psychic moment is taken to be mythical, then we can see that the status of infancy can be used to divide up times and persons based on the capacity to define oneself through language. If the dependent status of the child grants a kind of alibi to those figured as mature adults, the id obliges us to ask more insistent questions about what in this moment authors and authorizes. Turning backwards to the id is a turn to that imagined moment of the not yet. It is a moment suspended between childhood as a world that is freed of all experiences and another world in which experiences narrated by others accumulate, heavy, concrete, and material, and yet cannot serve as a resource for fantasy and imagination. With these insights from Agamben in mind, I turn to where he leaves us and start with that destruction of experience. To think that through, I specifically turn to 1950s France and North Africa to puzzle through that version of the destruction of experience and the responses afforded by phenomenology and psychology. I argue that the long history of French and North African experience with psychiatry offers one version of this alibi of minority and rests on the partial destruction of experience. Here, aliénation comes to be legally defined as the conjunction of two failed kinds of experiences, criminality and madness. Criminality, after all, is the transgression of a legally authorized experience. Madness could be taken to be a refusal of experience and its materiality. Practices of psychiatry then come to supplement law. These come together in defining what will count as aliénation. Returning to the experience of alienation in 1950s France entails then returning to a moment that shook the French imperial nation-state. Following the 1944 Conference of Brazzaville, France found itself in the inglorious position of trying to hold on to its colonies even as it ostensibly negotiated the terms of their liberation from the French Empire, all the while celebrating its own liberation from Germany. Alienation became associated with the dislocations of Jewish French citizens returning to France from the camps, who themselves were frequently diagnosed with schizophrenia and what is now called PTSD. Alienation is also associated with those interned in asylums by civil authorities or their families, and with those North Africans treated in both the Maghreb and metropolitan France, and those who were treated in metropolitan France were generally not repatriated. In such a context of social betrayal, of political occupation, of shattered families, the terms of alienation and any possible freedom operate on multiple registers. Across psychology, psychiatry, and philosophy emerged debates over the nature and the origin of aliénation mentale, of what interventions to pursue, and in the service of which political vision of freedom. State intervention simultaneously tied alienation more tightly to law and to property, and then covered over any attendant social conflicts by encouraging individuals to internalize these capacities for competence and responsibility. In France, the conceptual history of aliénation is rooted in the changing substance and form of relationships as they sprawl between the psychological and the social. By the end of the 17th century, aliénation came to denote those, the aliénés, the alienated, considered to be insane and subject to internment and guardianship. Alienation comes to index both insanity and the condition of social relationships, strained by things as various as gambling, vagabondage, or theft. After a brief experiment with family courts prior to the French Revolution, in which multiple family members attested to a relation's travails and shared in the decision of what to do, alienation and criminality become understood as failures of individual responsibility and become regulated by the Napoleonic Penal Code of 1810. And so aliénation becomes associated with French republicanism through Article 64 of this code, an article that determined that the rights of citizens are forfeited when subjects are determined to be criminal or insane, but subjects cannot be both at the same time. Likewise, France's colonies had similar codes. Think here of Article 38 of the Tunisian Penal Code that determined both criminality and the terms of voluntary commitment. Aliénation thus comes to bind criminality and madness as failures of responsibility within a liberal regime of property rights and citizenship. With the imperial nation-state, aliénation becomes a forced choice between being criminal and being mad, between avowing one's crimes or disavowing one's acts and state of mind. In both cases, one releases or relinquishes a form of political agency and standing. What is central to both kinds of estrangement is a kind of incompetence over patrimoine, the association of civil and personal incapacity with the political incapacity over heritage as well as property ownership. Notoriously, illegal acts result from either failures of political will or incapacities of political will, but not both, and lead to internment either in prison or in a psychiatric hospital. Hotly contested amongst families, parliamentarians, police, and yes, psychiatrists, the 1838 Loi des Aliénés emerges from parliamentary debates that wrestled more broadly with the nature of freedom under the July monarchy, with the nature of political capacities, property holding, and the institutional placement of the insane. So in order to reconcile individual liberty with public order, aliénation necessarily became a matter of public health. Psychiatrists who were forceful participants in these debates and were called aliénistes until roughly the 1960s became its interpreters. Earlier relationships of dependency or tutelage become spatially mapped onto now distinct modes of confinement. Where previously internment grouped together the poor, the insane, and the criminal under one roof, these populations now become separated and housed in distinct public institutions. No longer the responsibility of families or social milieu, the mentally ill are interned voluntarily by themselves or their families, or involuntarily by civil authorities. With the transfer to and the consolidation of familial violence under the state through the Napoleonic Civil Code, new capacities for political incapacity emerge. Penal reformers find this quite appealing because the hospital now allows them to camouflage the destruction of personality previously associated with the prison. Likewise, psychiatrists find this arrangement to be convenient because they can use therapeutic action to return patients to the law. Distinctions among those with minority status, as well as distinctions between the major and the minor, become a way to regulate political access and to endlessly defer challenges to the status quo. With the deepening of colonial occupation in this time, these categories regulate the tension between the subaltern and the juridical minor. After all, the poor, the so-called criminal, colonial subjects, and women posed a potential threat in times of democratization and capitalist expansion. Sharing similar interests for legal standing, for wages, for the right to work, for circulation, they might realize their numbers and join forces to renegotiate their minority status. So emergent from within these contradictions of the French imperial nation-state, aliénation mentale thus moves away from being framed on the terms of a social conflict that both produces and is threatened by criminality and mental illness. Instead, it becomes caught between two different political visions, an imperial vision of regulation and constraint on the one hand, and a republican vision of solidarity and citizenship on the other. Law becomes an important tool in orienting individual cases towards one vision of politics or to the other, while deflecting any contest over the political form of the imperial nation-state itself. As Etienne Balibar has argued, the binary nature of Article 64, the one that says that you can be mad or criminal but not both, reflects the binary nature of judicial form as it makes distinctions about competence and incompetence, responsibility, irresponsibility, and property ownership or custodianship. Nowhere are these contradictions more apparent than in North Africa. Those interned in North African psychiatric hospitals felt this two-ness acutely. As in France, patients were interned alternately at the behest of families or civil authorities. And historical evidence suggests that North African patients were committed by civil authorities at a higher rate than their European counterparts relative to familial requests. Beginning in the late 19th century, a shortage of beds locally meant that North African psychiatric patients often were referred to psychiatric hospitals in Aix-en-Provence, in Marseille, Saint-Alban, and Nice. These circulations back and forth across the Mediterranean only increased during the interwar period, and then again from 1948 to 1950. However, the governing juridical framework varied depending on the location of these patients. Those interned to North Africa were accorded the rights of French citizen once they were transferred to French hospitals, with a special emphasis on their right to circulation. However, they didn't have the right to return. North African immigrants to France, however, lacked the same status. In both instances, administrators agonized over how to manage property seized before this transfer, when patients were colonial subjects, or afterwards, when they became pseudo-citizens. As with the debates over the law of 1838, it becomes impossible to know if the rights of patients are the individual right to refuse constraint and insist on singularity, or a right to care, but where care is defined through bonds of solidarity or claims to public order premised on a notion of Frenchness. These political contradictions over how to define experience and who its biographer might be played out in a series of disciplinary debates. These debates within psychology, psychiatry, phenomenology coalesced around two central points. First, how to define and apprehend this object of analysis, that is alienation. What is going to count or to be denied as experience? As the imperialist 19th century unravels in the post-war period, aliénation mentale becomes revisioned first as maladie mentale, or mental illness, and then as psychopathology. More than a dispute over nomenclature, this shifting language signals a real disagreement over what kind of phenomenon is alienation, what kind of disorder or crisis does it index. A sharp divide, both in training and methodology, separated psychological theoreticians from clinical psychologists. Theoreticians credentialed in philosophy or biology, and with little to no clinical experience, privileged epistemology and insisted on the organic origins of disease. They wanted to be like the natural sciences. By contrast, clinical practitioners focused on the painstaking classification of empirical manifestations of illness that would invalidate these received theories. Foucault's early essay, Psychology from 1850 to 1950, surveys psychological inquiry as beset by an impossible contradiction. On the one hand, the desire to view psychology as rooted in the natural sciences, and on the other, facing the gradual recognition that inquiries into human experience turned to methodologies and practices increasingly from outside the natural sciences and increasingly connected to economic and social context. Aware of this divide, colonial psychiatrists such as Antoine Poirot sought to leverage their practical experience into professional status with a steady stream of publications framed around these meticulous classificatory schema published in mainstream French journals. Behind this disciplinary debate lies the question of whether and how distinctions between the normal and the pathological can be established, and additionally, how they come to take on social organization and significance. Second, political leanings further shaped understandings of psychological treatment, and particularly any curative vision of liberation from either disease or confinement. Remember, the 1950s are also a time when experience on the left is the ground of potential political transformation. Pavlov's work on social institutions as formative of individual behavior and implicitly a revolutionary new man found a vivid reception in France and, curiously, with Foucault initially. An experimental group of psychiatrists were preoccupied with this question of institutions and social context, including Henri Ey and Georges Daumaison, but also François Tosquez, Louis Le Guillon, Lucien Bonafé, and Félix Guattari. Radical in their political affiliations and their psychiatric practices, they coalesced around the hospitals of Saint-Alban and La Borde in France, and eventually the journal L'Évolution psychiatrique in North Africa. The group resisted turning towards organic causes or to a Freudian depth psychology, that is, to any kind of culturalist claims about the mad, or claims that would root illness in claims about personality. Instead, their clinical movement is outwards back to material social conditions. The psychiatrist Henri Ey, an early admirer of both Foucault and Fanon, defines mental illness as a pathology of liberty, not of persons. Ey writes that humans are best, quote, envisioned in his commerce with another, the person in situation, the person making himself by producing the environment that he reflects and in which he roots himself through the movement of pulling it away from himself to define his own person. Ey then concludes that the patient doesn't suffer in his body despite its weight. He suffers in his coexistence with others. Pathology emerges from deficiencies in freedom, not in opposition to freedom, nor as deficiencies of person. And so Henri Ey tries to wrest experience away from those researchers who are disconnected from clinical practice and to reorient its biographers to include clinicians and social intermediaries. So the first dimension of this effort to reclaim the expropriation of experience comes through phenomenology. Bound together in this moment, thinkers such as Fanon and Foucault turned to the phenomenology of lived experience for a methodology and a vocabulary that is sufficient to the socio-political dynamics that are caught between these two visions of political order. Both thinkers argue that we cannot think mental and physical pathologies on the same terms. The diagnostic methods, the singularity of cases, the treatment of mental illness are ineluctably inflected by social milieu, and in contrast, organic pathology cannot be established or scrutinized using methods rooted in the natural sciences. Foucault argues, in mental pathology, the reality of the patient does not permit such an abstraction, and each morbid individuality must be understood through the practices of the milieu with regard to him. Every effort to abstract away from the singular, to establish criteria of health and normalcy, or to define morbidity lends itself to a metaphysics of humans that rests on an artificial unity of man. So morbidity here I take as the endless process of becoming minor, when it's no longer possible to make meaning out of suffering, where the only purpose of the minor is to lend distinction to the major or the politically mature. As psychology wrestles with how to define those experiences that count, and whether minority reflects biology or social milieu, phenomenology then offers something else. Canguilhem draws on phenomenology to consider distinctions between the normal and pathological as socially driven. For Merleau-Ponty, phenomenology would seem to hold the promise of grasping objects from the inside and to recognize that illness composes the patient's world. And then, as Fanon puts it in his dissertation, every illness must unfold in a social space that gives it its form. Fanon uses phenomenology then to explode the racialized experience of lives lived in excess of colonial order. It offers a descriptive language for those minor experiences that never seems to be more than a supplement to major ones. Phenomenology further offers a vocabulary that seems to account for how what it calls different segments, that is, gestures, dreams, associations, coalesce into an existence, one that has historical anteriority and implications. Phenomenological psychiatry struggles with how to characterize these segments. Ludwig Binswanger moves away from consciousness and towards dream and imagination. Merleau-Ponty again seeks to recover the sense-making on more corporeal terms, and so to rejoin the organic and the psychological. Foucault ultimately realizes that the second element for reappropriating experience is working with this historical anteriority. Historicization becomes a means to disrupt the usual narration of experience, to reveal its contradictory politics. History offers a mean to recover psychosocial conflicts that have been disavowed, such that illness, aliénation, cannot articulate this lived contradiction between two worlds. He locates rupture in Freud's use of individual history as a counter to evolutionary accounts of personality. Freud's own turn to history and symptomology makes the past something in constant conversation with the present and potentially interruptive of it through neurotic structures. Repetition, projection, and repression, these are all means for subjects to protect themselves from a present that has become crushing and threatens annihilation. Foucault writes, the ill man cannot recognize himself as a man in the conditions of existence which man himself has constituted. With this new content, alienation is no longer a psychological aberration, it's defined by a historical moment. In this case, however, aliénation is not the result of ambivalence or repressed meanings. Instead, living in this colonial world that Foucault and Fanon both describe as silent, icy, and dead, entails being trapped in a world that doesn't signify, and so is dissociated from meaning-making altogether. Dissociation demands a different kind of work than working through repression. It demands the work of genealogy, or of intervening differently than repression in the uses and abuses of history for living. History thus becomes a way to return to that suspended moment that Agamben had left us in, that moment of infancy, a moment of fantasy and imagination that is not yet narrated and not yet moralized. So history and genealogy help to excavate why minority is so difficult to bring to an end in France. The contradictions of republicanism and imperialism, of singularity and solidarity, make the political ground constantly shift and become unstable. But genealogy has its limits. It can only chart the disjunctures that characterize the shifting ground, that allow for this never-ending process of becoming minor to persist and recur. It cannot, however, offer an account of how to organize politically on different terms. Fanon sees this dilemma, and as Gerard Etching has argued, he urges caution about how we reconcile consciousness as both an object of clinical psychoanalysis and the means by which the subject of political action assumes subjectivity. Post-Fanonian thinkers linger on two reasons for the persistence of this gap between object and subject: the lack of protective shelter or anonymity for colonized bodies, and here I'm thinking of the work by Gail Solomon, or the ongoing traumatic context of colonialism that makes it difficult to link personal trauma to a singular public event. And here I'm thinking of the work of Karima Lazali. The problem with modern renderings of experience is that humans, but especially colonial subjects, are both objects of a politically framed experience and potentially subjects of revolt against it. Bridging these two experiences requires intervening in that ceaseless process of becoming minor. It entails not just disrupting the distinction between major and minor, as Foucault would suggest, but also of making the return to infancy, a return to a moment of some suspension. Again, it needs to be a reinvigoration of the capacity for imagination and becoming otherwise. The experience of being trapped between being an object of politics and a would-be subject of revolt is what Fanon calls a dislocated personality, or what psychiatrists much later than Fanon will name as dissociation. Dissociation is that experience in which thoughts, feelings, and experiences are split off into discontinuous self-states such that you can't gather yourself into, someone overcoming your self-incurred immaturity. Dissociation results from a historical trauma that shatters the self and leaves a person living in an in-between zone, one that is bookended by the terror of self-annihilation and that fear of biological death. Differently from repression, this experience is neither buried in the unconscious nor manifests through anxiety around some past event, although it might present with the same phenomenological symptoms of helplessness. As those affected lose the ability to play and experiment with their world, their present becomes overwhelmed with indigestible and repetitive traumatic memories. Fanon notes in the case histories of Wretched of the Earth that such experience compromised the patient's sense of the future. Where Foucault could counter diagnostic claims to criminality and madness with an appeal first to personal then genealogical history, Fanon must turn elsewhere. His patients lack an obvious trigger event other than that bloody, pitiless atmosphere that creates the impression that they are witnessing a veritable apocalypse. Catastrophic dissociation leaves survivors in a state of confusion and ennui. It is not adaptive like depression or anxiety, and so it requires intervention in the rebuilding of community, not just the rebuilding of personality. What would it mean to treat such dissociation, that is to recite its experience, to tell it on different terms? Within this colonial context, the psychiatric hospital, as I mentioned in 2019, serves as one of the few social sites that endures the transition from military occupation of Algeria to its colonial settlement. The hospital is not simply a site of confinement, it actively generates new relations of rule that operate through new iterations of colonial sociality, or that endless process of becoming minor. Following World War II, colonial hospitals in the Maghreb become caught between the contradictory aims of the imperial nation-state. If the medical corps initially supported military troops, with the advent of more troops and civilian settlers comes a more varied European population and new interactions with native inhabitants. Those aliénés were no longer committed only through administrative placement. They could be now committed by friends and neighbors through what was called a voluntary placement, in which their will, their volonté, substitutes for that of a would-be patient. In support of different visions of order and new technologies of rule, hospitals came to manage new groups and to adapt the violence of colonialism to new political and moral exigencies under the aegis of public health. Differently put, hierarchies of domination replicate through the production of marginalized subjects and in a way that creates new patterns of interaction. Historian Richard Keller describes that psychiatric hospitals were alternately oriented to those alienated through either a moral economy of care or a moral economy of production. The first sought to recognize local cultures and traditions so as to acknowledge their singularity and inferiority. The second sought to dissolve local communities within colonial reality, while also marginally improving the tolerance of the abnormal in this world. Notably, both responses were developed in relation to the 1838 law that embedded treatment within a property rights regime, one that shored up the ethics of rights and responsibility, while the other targets the material productivity of citizen subjects. The peculiar recursivity of violence in North Africa thus remains profoundly indexed towards this law as one way to contain political and social unrest. Later innovations in open service treatment that allowed patients to go home in the evening were adapted by Antoine Poirot in his treatment of European settlers, first in Tunis and then at Blida. This open service or outpatient treatment was hailed as economically solving the problem of assistance for lunatics. Indigenous Tunisians, by contrast, continued to rely on family care or local resources. This segregation and its uneasy mix of domination and assimilation came to a head with the design for the hospital at Blida. In Blida, European, Algerian, and very occasionally Berber patients lived in wards segregated by gender and culture. Blida's provision of universal care for citizen subjects had to be balanced against the divisions that were necessary to maintain Algiers' urban segregation of indigenous settlers or indigenous peoples and European settlers. The hospital was to offer what was called social protection and to impede instances in which colonial agitation or disordered minds might lead to violence in this context. The hospital thus exemplified the transformation of earlier military hierarchies of non-interference into new and broader relations of colonial rule, defined through property, responsibility, and public order. The hospital thus architecturally entrenched a differentiated assimilation, while its public health mission absorbed moral critiques of such domination. Again, this is the alibi of minority. It performs a minoritization of the subaltern, quite literally the emplacement of minorities within the contradictions of belonging and difference. Architecturally, then, the hospital administers over the inability to think symbolically or to use imagination. So what Fanon does in seizing this institution and reworking it is to move it away from economic productivity and responsibility, the language alternately of liberalism and republicanism, and to try and reconfigure its aims and reproductive strategies. Cognizant of the sociality and the temporality that's unique to colonial trauma, Fanon innovates a series of reforms that are designed to restore the ability to exert power through the control of one's own bodily space. More extensive reforms come later in Tunis, where he continues that open service clinic, but extends it beyond European patients to those who live in the so-called inflammatory milieu. Practically attuned to the movement of norms as they start to compose and recompose a social milieu, Fanon enlists the works of teams that collaborate with one another as part of this same life milieu to further the dialectic between agitation and context. Where once indigenous families participated in treatment only through voluntary placement, which effectively drew them into a Republican property rights regime, they now find themselves in collaboration with an institution looking to contain a sociality less defined on the terms of compartmentalization. The family becomes the site of all mediations. Cognizant that even these changes would produce new ossifications over time, Fanon exhorted his staff to make the institution a generous source, one with both its solidity and plasticity that enables multiple personalities to manifest in it. In this way, Fanon moves patients, but also doctors and staff, families, back and forth across the boundaries of the clinic, both to unsettle the figure of the psychiatrist and the minor, but also to engage in the symbolic work of shoring up sense-making in the context of a colonial society. His institutional work seeks to vivify what might become a living culture defined in reference to alternate symbolic forms. His disalienation, then, thus is more than disabusing patients of colonial trauma. It entails grappling with a profound break in history, with the phenomenon of absence, and with the place for violence in both. Grappling with the unknowable history that has been silenced by trauma, with the future's past, with those patients whose lives are barely recorded. Many of the patients who figure in Wretched of the Earth are haunted by the past, the cafe bomber anguished by the anniversary of the bombing, or the militant whose retribution for his mother's death leaves him feeling awash in blood. Others, and especially female patients, go unremarked and unrecorded. History bears down on the body with such weight and such inheritance that it flattens this body. Jean Kolfe has gone so far as to argue that the self of the colonized is inexorably constituted by history, not the family. Bodies and memories become fragments of objects rather than potentialities or projects for action in the world. Politically, this means that any poetics cannot be a recovery of a nativist past, nor an accommodation to colonialist structures. Fanon delves further into the social relations of alienation to probe the kind of work taken up by the militant, the intellectual, the doctor, the patient. Each of these roles returns us to social relationships. Fanon notes that the problem is knowing what role these men have in store for their people, the type of social relations they will establish, their idea of the future of humanity. These relationships, rather than personal history, become the seat of the labor of disalienation. In turning to a range of different figures, Fanon acknowledges that the psychiatric hospital can't be the only or even the primary site for disalienation. He's constantly pushing us out back into the world. And so its primary work is on those who are seemingly peripheral to the institution, minor to it. Again, staff and patient families. These minor peripheral figures are central, though, to a sociality that might refuse to perpetuate the marginalization of its own members. If violence represents the absolute praxis, as Fanon says in Wretched of the Earth, well, then a range of figures can, in fact, intervene into an array of different violences, psychic violences, those political, those gendered, those social, and to make such interventions the tools and trade of disalienation. These figures labor on the construction of a new set of symbolic relationships that would restore power and agency to the perceptions of the once colonized. So I want to conclude with a few reflections on where we find ourselves then in this moment of suspension that is in fancy. Such an infancy is experienced not yet alienated, but also not yet enunciated in relation to some kind of truth or truthfulness. In our efforts to grasp and to cite infancy, we may try to say that it is pre-linguistic, to seek it in psychological facts or neurology or child psychology. Each of these in different ways seeks to capture a wordless experience or one that is pre-subjective. Such efforts, though, are a fantasy. Refusing this fantasy means to think in terms of those experiences of the ineffable, of the not yet signifying, of the historicizing that can find traces of these experiences retrospectively and through a laborious process of revivification. Such historicizing is characterized by a playfulness that breaks the connection between past and present. Children play with the temporalizing essence of human beings and how history arises from changes in meaning across different configurations of political and social. Such play, according to Agamben, breaks down structures into events, into fragments, fragments that might be induced to do a different kind of signifying work. It's a way of freeing us from these otherwise sort of overdetermining structures associated with colonialism. So Fanon's hospital breaks with the minor in two ways. He sees in his patients an experience that has become profoundly alienated by living in a morbid, weighty colonial world. This dissociation that characterizes colonial trauma leaves patients unable to meaningfully invent. His hospital then seeks to coax patients to relinquish this traumatic experience and to make wordless experience do a different kind of work. In rejecting the minority status that makes fantasy and imagination something separate from, disconnected from experience, Fanon creates an environment that might encourage the play of in fancy, but for adults. Released from this never-ending status of being minor, subalterns could express the agency that permits them to be biographers of their own experience. Second, the activity of playful historicizing then faces a different task. Instead of confronting the tension between autobiography and biography, the tension between they say and I say, playful historicizing faces something else. It faces the task of confronting those blank spaces of memory, the blank spaces where injurious structures don't obviously connect to injury and don't obviously break down into events. The goal of radical psychiatry then would not be to connect injury to what is taken to be real, so as to stabilize and to reiterate trauma in the psyche. It would be to release people from having to prove constantly this connection between injury and the real. It would release them from seeking authorization for it altogether. It would release them from shaping it to fit what might be their own autobiography. Thank you.